The night Abdul Rahman Bello followed his maid, he wasn't prepared for what he would hear. She walked alone through the dim outskirts of Lagos, disappearing into a crumbling, abandoned house no one should be living in. Abdul stayed in the shadows, watching, until a weak voice from inside broke the silence. Abdul. His heart stopped. No one here should know his name. No one should recognize him in the dark. Yet the voice sounded certain, familiar, waiting. And in that moment, the powerful billionaire realized whatever secret this house held. It was somehow tied to him. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? If stories like this move you, take a second to subscribe and be part of this journey. Abdul Rahman Bello was not a man who noticed small things. He owned towers that touched the Lagos skyline, chaired board meetings, where decisions moved millions overnight, and lived in a mansion so vast that silence echoed through its marble corridors like a presence of its own. His days were structured with precision, his time measured in contracts, investments, and power. People did not exist in his world as individuals, they existed as roles, functions, outcomes. Except, somehow, Zainab had slipped past that system. She had been working in his household for nearly 8 months before Abdul truly saw her. Not because she was invisible, but because she moved in a way that avoided attention. She was always early, always efficient, always gone before anyone could ask where she came from or where she was going. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes lowered, and carried herself with a quiet discipline that felt different from the other staff. At first, Abdul noticed her absence more than her presence. There were evenings when he would step into the dining hall and everything would already be perfectly arranged: the table, set the glass polished to a shine, the air faintly scented with something clean and warm. Yet no one was there. Only later did he realize it had been her doing. Zainab Musa, the name meant nothing to him, and yet slowly she began to occupy a corner of his awareness he could not explain. It started with small inconsistencies. One afternoon, Abdul returned home earlier than expected. The sun was still high, spilling golden light across the compound walls. As he stepped inside, he heard a faint sound from the kitchen, not the usual clatter of work, but something softer. A voice. He paused. Zainab was standing alone near the sink, her back slightly turned. She wasn't working. She was praying. Her voice was low, almost trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. Abdul could not make out the words, but there was something in the tone, something raw, something heavy that made him stand still, longer than he intended. Then she turned slightly and their eyes almost met. Almost. She quickly wiped her face, adjusted her posture, and resumed washing dishes as if nothing had happened. Abdul said nothing. But that moment stayed with him. Days later, another detail. Zainab always left the house before sunset. Not just early, precisely early, as if she was racing against something unseen. No matter what task remained, she would complete her work with unusual speed, clean her hands, and quietly inform the head housekeeper she was leaving. No overtime, no delay, no explanation. At first the housekeeper had complained. "She's efficient, sir, but stubborn. Refuses to stay late like the others." Abdul had dismissed it, until he noticed something else. She never used the staff transport. Every evening, as the other workers gathered near the gate to board the van, Zainab would walk past them without a word and exit on foot, alone, into the city. That was when curiosity began to turn into something sharper. One evening, Abdul stood by the tall glass window in his study overlooking the compound. From there he could see the gate, the driveway, and beyond it the faint movement of the street outside. He watched as Zainab stepped out again. Same routine, same quiet pace. No hesitation. She disappeared beyond the gate, like a shadow slipping into another world. Abdul frowned. People like Zainab did not live nearby. not in neighborhoods that required walking distance, not without transport, not without explanation. Something didn't add up. The next morning he called his personal assistant. "Get me her file." Abdul said, his tone neutral. Within the hour, a slim folder was placed on his desk. Zainab Musa, age 24, origin Kano State, previous employment domestic work, various short-term positions. References minimal, no family listed, no emergency contact. Abdul flipped through the pages slowly. Too clean, too empty. It was the kind of file that told you just enough to pass, but nothing enough to understand. "Run a deeper check," he instructed. The assistant hesitated slightly. "Sir, everything here appears legitimate." "I didn't ask what appears," Abdul replied calmly. "I asked what is." The assistant nodded and left, but even before the results came back, Abdul already knew. There was something about her that didn't belong to paperwork. It was in the way she avoided eye contact, not out of fear but control. It was in the way she moved, careful, deliberate, as if every second mattered. And most of all, it was in that moment in the kitchen, when her voice carried something far heavier than the life of a simple maid. 2 days later, the report came. Still nothing. No hidden accounts, no criminal records, no traceable family. It was as if Zainab Musa had appeared into existence just enough to survive, and nothing more. Abdul closed the file. For the first time in years, something unsettled him. Not a business risk, not a financial threat, but a person. That evening he made a decision he would not normally make. He left his study earlier than usual and waited. Not inside, outside. Near the far end of the compound where the staff exit gate stood, beneath a flickering security light. He stood there in the shadow, dressed simply without the usual presence that announced who he was. No driver, no guards, just him, waiting. Minutes passed, then she appeared. Zainab Musa. She stepped out of the staff quarters, adjusting the edge of her worn scarf, her movements quick but composed. She didn't look around, didn't linger. She simply walked, straight toward the gate. For a brief second, Abdul considered calling out to her, asking a question, stopping her. But something in him resisted. No, if there was a truth here, it would not come from asking, it would come from seeing. Zainab passed through the gate and disappeared onto the street. Abdul waited 3 seconds. Then he followed, not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as a shadow. And for the first time in a long time, Abdul Rahman Bello stepped out of his controlled world, into a path he did not understand, a path that was about to lead him somewhere he could never have imagined. Abdul Rahman Bello had built his life on control. Every movement, every decision, every outcome calculated. Even risk, when taken, was measured and contained. But as he stepped out into the humid Lagos evening trailing behind Zainab Musa, at a careful distance he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his instincts. Uncertainty. The city outside his gated compound was a different world entirely. The air changed first. Inside the mansion everything was filtered, cool, quiet, controlled. Outside, the air carried heat dust and the layered scent of human life, roadside food, fuel, sweat, rain-soaked earth. It wrapped around him, immediate and unrefined. Zainab walked ahead without hesitation. She did not look back. That alone told Abdul something. This was not new to her. This path, whatever it was, had been walked many times before. She moved past the well-lit streets of the affluent district, quickly blending into the dimmer edges of the city where streetlights flickered and the roads narrowed. Abdul kept his distance, adjusting his pace, his posture, even his breathing. He was not dressed like a man of his status. No tailored suit, no polished shoes that reflected light. Tonight he wore something simple. Dark trousers, a plain shirt. Still there was a part of him that felt exposed. not because anyone recognized him, but because for once he was entering a space where his wealth meant nothing. Zainab turned left into a crowded roadside market. The transition was immediate. Voices rose in overlapping layers, vendors calling out prices, children weaving through narrow paths, the clatter of metal bowls and wooden tables. Dim bulbs hung from makeshift stalls, casting uneven light across faces that barely noticed him. Abdul slowed. This was not his world, and yet Zainab moved through it like she belonged. She greeted. No one spoke to no one, but her presence carried familiarity. People shifted slightly as she passed, not out of respect, but recognition. She was part of this place. Abdul felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years building an empire in this city, yet there were entire lives unfolding within it that he had never truly seen. Zainab exited the market and continued walking. The streets grew narrower. The buildings changed less concrete, more rusted metal and patched wood. Drainage water ran along the sides of the road, reflecting fragments of light. The noise softened, replaced by a quieter, heavier stillness. Abdul hesitated for a moment. This was far beyond where he had ever walked. But Zainab didn't slow down. So neither did he. She crossed a small open space where children played barefoot on dusty ground, their laughter cutting through the dimness. One of them glanced up at her and smiled. She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened for a brief second. It was the first time Abdul had seen any change in her expression, and it struck him harder than he expected. She kept walking, further, deeper, until even the faint sounds of the main road disappeared behind them. Now there was only silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that held things, the kind that watched. Zainab finally slowed her pace. Abdul instinctively stepped back, slipping behind a half-collapsed wall, his eyes fixed on her. She stood still for a moment, as if listening. Then she moved again toward a structure that barely looked like a house anymore. It stood alone, slightly tilted, its walls cracked and stained with time. The roof sagged in places, and parts of it had clearly been patched with mismatched materials. No lights shone from outside. No sign of life. Abdul frowned. This was where she came. Every night Zainab approached the door without hesitation. She pushed it open. The wood creaked faintly, and for a brief moment the darkness inside seemed to swallow her whole. Then she disappeared inside. Abdul remained where he was, watching, waiting. His mind moved quickly now, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A maid, working in one of the most secure, luxurious homes in Lagos, returning each night to a place like this. It didn't align. It didn't fit any narrative he understood. Minutes passed, too quiet. Abdul felt the urge to move closer. He resisted at first. This was already further than he should have gone. But something pulled at him, something stronger than logic. Curiosity, yes, but also something else. Something that had been building since that moment in the kitchen, since the sound of her voice carried something heavier than words. He stepped forward, carefully, each movement measured. The ground beneath his feet shifted slightly with dust and loose debris, but he kept his balance. His eyes fixed on the house, closer now, close enough to see details. The door hung slightly off its hinges. The walls bore marks of age, of weather, of neglect, and yet there was a faint glow from inside. Not electric, soft, unsteady, like fire. Abdul's heart began to beat a little faster. He reached the side of the house, positioning himself near a narrow opening where part of the wall had broken away. From there he could see inside. Zainab was kneeling on the floor. In front of her was a small oil lamp, its flame flickering weakly, casting shadows across the room. And beside that light, someone else. An older woman, thin, fragile, lying on a worn mattress placed directly on the floor. Zainab was speaking softly, now her voice gentle, different from anything Abdul had heard before. Not the quiet obedience of a maid, but something deeper, something intimate. "Amma," she whispered, adjusting the cloth beneath the woman's head. The woman shifted slightly, her breathing uneven. Abdul leaned closer, straining to hear. This was it. The answer. The truth behind the silence, the routine, the mystery. But before Zainab could say anything more, the older woman's eyes slowly opened. And then she spoke, soft, weak, but unmistakable. "Abdul Rahman." The name hit him like a physical force. Abdul froze, every muscle in his body locked in place, his breath caught in his throat. No, that was impossible. He hadn't made a sound. He hadn't revealed himself. There was no way, Abdul. The woman repeated, her voice trembling as if calling across years of waiting. Abdul staggered back slightly, his mind racing, his heart pounding in a way he had not felt in decades. How could she know his name? How could anyone in this place, inside the house? Zainab stiffened, her head turned sharply toward the direction of the broken wall, toward him. Abdul didn't move, couldn't move. For the first time in his life, Abdul Rahman Bello was not in control of the moment, because whatever secret lived inside that broken house, it already knew him. Abdul Rahman Bello did not run. Every instinct in his body told him to step back, to disappear into the darkness, to return to the controlled world he understood. But something deeper, something heavier rooted him to the ground. Inside the broken house, silence stretched between breaths. Zainab's eyes were fixed on the opening in the wall, her body tense as if she had sensed a presence even before she saw it. The small oil lamp flickered beside her, casting shadows that moved across her face, revealing something Abdul had never seen before. Not just caution, fear. "Who is there?" she called softly but firmly. Abdul hesitated. For a man who commanded boardrooms without raising his voice, who negotiated deals worth millions with unshakable composure, this moment felt different, uncertain, dangerous in a way he couldn't define. He could have stayed hidden. But the voice of the old woman still echoed in his mind. Abdul Rahman. No one outside his inner circle used his full name like that. Not with that tone, not with that weight. Slowly, he stepped forward. The weak light from the lamp reached his face as he moved into view. Zainab's breath caught. Her eyes widened, not in recognition but in shock. "Sir." The word slipped from her lips before she could stop it. For a brief second, the distance between their two worlds collapsed. The billionaire and the maid, standing face to face in a place neither of them was meant to share. Abdul didn't answer her immediately. His gaze had already shifted past her, to the woman lying on the mattress. Up close, she looked even more fragile than before. Her face was lined with age and suffering, her skin drawn tight against her bones. Yet her eyes, though weak, held something sharp, something aware, and they were looking directly at him. Not searching, not questioning, recognizing. "You came," she whispered. Abdul's throat tightened. "I don't know you," he said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual authority. The woman's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something sadder. "Not anymore," she replied. Zainab turned between them, confusion rising quickly into anger. "What is this?" she demanded, stepping protectively closer to her mother. "Why are you here?" Abdul finally looked at her. Really looked. For the first time he saw beyond the uniform, beyond the silence she carried in his house. Here, in this dim light, she was different. Not smaller, not weaker, but real. "I followed you," he said simply. Her eyes hardened immediately. "You had no right." I know, he replied without hesitation. That seemed to catch her off guard for a moment. But only for a moment. You should leave, Zainab said firmly. Whatever you think you're doing here, it ends now. Abdul didn't move. His attention returned to the woman. Mariam Sani, he said slowly, testing the name that had surfaced in his investigation. The woman's breathing shifted. A reaction. You remember the name, she whispered. Abdul shook his head. No, I found it. A pause, then softer. But it feels like I should. Zainab's expression flickered. Something in that exchange unsettled her, more than Abdul's presence itself. You need to go, she repeated, this time with urgency. Now, but Mariam lifted a weak hand, stopping her. Let him stay, she said. Amma, let him stay, Mariam, repeated her voice, gaining a fragile strength. Zainab hesitated. Her eyes moved between them, uncertainty and resistance battling inside her. Finally, she stepped back slightly, but not far. Never far from her mother. Abdul took a slow step forward. The air inside the room felt heavier, thicker with unspoken things. You called my name, he said quietly. How Mariam closed her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. When you carry a name long enough, she murmured, it becomes part of your breath. Abdul frowned. That doesn't answer my question. No, she agreed softly. It doesn't. Zainab clenched her hands. This is pointless, she said. He doesn't belong here. Mariam opened her eyes again. But he does. The words landed heavily. Abdul felt something shift inside him, a discomfort he couldn't shake. What do you mean? He asked. Mariam studied his face carefully. Not as a stranger, but as someone searching for something she had once known. You don't remember, she said. It wasn't a question. Abdul's jaw tightened. Remember what? Zainab stepped forward again. That's enough, she snapped. You don't get to come here, confuse everything, and act like you deserve answers. Abdul met her gaze. I didn't come for answers, he said. I came because something doesn't make sense. Zainab let out a bitter breath. Of course it doesn't. This life never makes sense to people like you. The words hit sharper than they should have. Abdul didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, the cracked walls, the thin mattress, the flickering lamp. This was where she lived, where she returned to every night after cleaning his marble floors, after serving his meals, after existing quietly in a world that never asked where she came from. Something twisted inside him. You could have asked for help, he said. Zainab laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Help, she repeated. From who? From me. That made her expression change completely. Not into gratitude, not into relief, but into something colder. From you, she said slowly. Mariam watched them both silent now. Zainab stepped closer to Abdul, her voice dropping. You don't even know who we are. Abdul held her gaze. Then tell me. A long pause. Then no. The answer was final, absolute. Abdul exhaled slowly. Something ties you to me, he said. Your mother knows my name. She speaks like what? Zainab cut in sharply. He hesitated. Like someone who had waited. Like someone who had known him before he became who he was now. But he didn't say it out loud. Instead, he said, like this isn't the first time our lives crossed. Silence, heavy, unavoidable. Mariam's breathing grew more uneven. Zainab immediately turned back to her, her anger dissolving into concern. Amma, rest, she said softly, adjusting the cloth again. Abdul watched them, the way Zainab's hands moved with care, the way her voice softened, the way everything about her changed when she wasn't inside his house. This was the real Zainab Musa, and he had never seen her. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. Zainab didn't look at him. "Tell you what, that you live like this." She stilled for a second, then continued her movements. "It's not your concern." Abdul took another step forward. "It is now." Zainab turned sharply. "No," she said firmly. "It's not." Their eyes locked, and for the first time, Abdul saw something clear. Not fear, not submission, but defiance. Real, unfiltered defiance. "You don't get to walk into our lives and decide what matters," she continued. "You don't get to fix anything." Abdul's voice softened. "I'm not trying to fix it." "Then what are you trying to do?" He didn't answer immediately. Because for once, he didn't know. Mariam's voice broke through the tension. "Some truths don't come when you demand them," she whispered. "They come when you are ready to carry them." Abdul looked at her again. "And am I ready?" Mariam held his gaze. "No." The answer was quiet, but absolute. A long silence followed. Then Zainab spoke again, her voice steady. "You need to leave." This time there was no anger in it, just certainty. Abdul stood there for a moment longer, looking at both of them, at the life he had never seen, at the truth that had not yet been revealed. Then slowly, he stepped back toward the door, but before he turned away completely, he said, "I'll come back." Zainab didn't respond. Mariam closed her eyes, and as Abdul stepped out into the darkness again, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever connected him to that house, it was not a coincidence. It was something buried, something waiting, and it was only beginning to rise. Abdul Rahman Bello did not sleep that night. Back in his mansion, everything looked exactly as it always had. Polished floors, silent corridors, controlled lighting, the distant hum of air conditioning. But something inside him had shifted. The order he had built his life around no longer felt stable. It felt incomplete. He stood by the window in his study, staring out at the city lights stretching across Lagos like a sea of quiet fire. But all he could see was that house. The cracked walls, the flickering lamp, the woman who knew his name, and Zainab, the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with admiration, but with something far more unsettling. Truth. Abdul exhaled slowly and turned away from the glass. He had spent years solving problems that others could not even understand. He had built companies from nothing, navigated crises that would have broken lesser men. But this was different. This was not a business. This was not a deal. This was something personal. And that made it dangerous. He pressed a button on his desk. Within moments, his personal assistant, Sadiq Lawal, entered. Sadiq had worked with Abdul for over a decade, efficient, discreet, and above all loyal. If there was information to be found, Sadiq would find it. "You called Sir Abdul didn't sit. Close the door." Sadiq did. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Mariam Sani," Abdul said. "Not surface level. I want records, history, connections. Go back as far as you can." Sadiq nodded immediately. "Understood." Abdul paused. "And, Sadiq?" "Yes, sir. If there are gaps, I want to know why they exist." Sadiq's expression sharpened slightly. "That means someone may have removed something," he said carefully. Abdul met his eyes. "Exactly." Sadiq gave a small nod. "I'll start immediately." As he turned to leave, Abdul added, "And keep this confidential." Sadiq didn't need to ask why. He simply said, "Of course, sir." The door closed again, leaving Abdul alone with his thoughts. For the first time in years, he wasn't certain what he would find. And that uncertainty followed him into the next day. The mansion moved as it always did. Staff arrived early. Tasks were completed in silence. The rhythm of order remained untouched. But Abdul was watching now. Not everything. Just one person. Zainab Musa. She moved through the house exactly as before. Quiet, efficient, invisible. But now that Abdul had seen her in that other world, he could no longer unsee it. Every action she took inside his home carried a second meaning. Every silence, a hidden weight. At one point, she passed through the hallway while he stood near the staircase. For a brief moment, their eyes met. This time, she didn't look away immediately. But she didn't hold the gaze either. Just long enough to acknowledge. Then she continued walking. Nothing spoken, everything understood. Abdul felt something shift again. Whatever existed between them now, it had changed. By afternoon, Sadiq returned. The file he placed on Abdul's desk was thicker than the previous one. But not by much. That's everything Abdul asked. Sadiq hesitated. It's everything I could find, officially. Abdul sat down slowly. Explain. Sadiq opened the file and pointed to several sections. Mariam Sani appears in employment records from about 25 years ago. She worked as domestic staff for a high-profile household in Abuja. Abdul's fingers stilled. Which household? Sadiq met his gaze. Your family's estate, sir. The room fell silent. For a brief moment, even the distant sounds of the city seemed to disappear. Abdul leaned back slightly. That's not possible, he said. But even as he said it, something inside him resisted. Not denial, recognition. Sadiq continued carefully. There are gaps in the records. Large ones. After a certain point, her file disappears completely. No termination report. No relocation. Nothing. People don't just disappear from records like that, Abdul said. No, Sadiq agreed. They don't. A pause. Then unless someone makes them disappear. Abdul's jaw tightened. Who would have the authority to do that? Sadiq didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Abdul already knew. Back then, the household had been controlled by his father, Chief Rahman Bello, a man who valued reputation above everything else, a man who believed that problems were not solved, they were erased. Abdul stood up slowly. Keep going, he said. Sadiq nodded. There's more. Around the same time Mariam's records vanish, there are internal notes referencing an incident. The details are missing, but the timing aligns. What kind of incident? That part is unclear, but whatever it was serious enough to remove her entirely from the system. Abdul felt a dull pressure building behind his eyes. Fragments of memory began to surface. Not clear, not complete, but present. A woman, voices raised, his father's anger, and something else, something he had never fully understood. Was there any mention of a child? Abdul asked quietly. Sadiq shook his head. No official records. Abdul exhaled slowly. Of course there weren't. If something had been hidden, it had been hidden completely. What about Zainab Musa? Abdul asked. Sadiq flipped a few pages. Her records begin much later. Early adulthood. No birth certificate linked to Mariam Sani. No registered family connection. Abdul's eyes darkened. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. Sadiq nodded. It just means it was never documented. Silence filled the room again, heavy, unavoidable. Abdul walked toward the window once more. The city stretched out before him. But now it looked different. Not just as something he owned, but as something that held pieces of a past he had never truly faced. Sir, Sadiq said, carefully. Do you want me to continue digging? Abdul didn't turn around. Yes. A pause. And Sadiq. Yes, if this connects to my father. Sadiq straightened slightly. I understand. Abdul finally turned. No, he said quietly. You don't. Because if this was true, if Mariam Sani had once been part of his family's household, if she had been erased, then whatever happened back then, he had been there. Even if he didn't remember, even if he had chosen not to remember. That evening, Abdul stood at the same spot near the staff exit again. Waiting, watching, Zainab appeared as she always did. Same routine, same quiet determination. But this time, when she reached the gate, she stopped, just for a second. Then she turned. Her eyes found him immediately. No surprise, no confusion, just certainty. "You're going to follow me again," she said. Not a question, a statement. Abdul stepped forward slightly. Yes. She studied him for a moment. Then this time, "Don't hide." The words lingered in the air, different from before. Not an invitation, not quite a warning, something in between. Zainab turned and walked out through the gate. And this time, Abdul didn't wait. He followed, not as a shadow, but as a man stepping directly into a truth he could no longer avoid. Whatever had been buried in that abandoned house was no longer hidden, and whatever role he had played in it was about to come into the light. This time Abdul Rahman Bello did not keep his distance. He walked a few steps behind Zainab Musa, close enough that the rhythm of her footsteps became part of his own. The space between them was no longer about secrecy. It was about tension. Unspoken, unresolved. The evening air pressed around them as Lagos slowly shifted from day into night. The same streets he had followed before now felt different, not unfamiliar but exposed, as if by choosing not to hide, he had stepped into a version of the city that would not allow him to remain untouched. Zainab did not speak. Neither did Abdul. Yet everything between them spoke. They passed through the main road into the crowded market, where voices rose and fell like waves. Vendors called out. Generators hummed. Children ran between bodies with practiced ease. But even in the noise, there was a strange silence surrounding them. People noticed, not who Abdul was, but what he represented. He did not belong here, and, for the first time, he felt it. Not as observation, as truth. Zainab moved through the crowd with quiet certainty. Abdul followed, aware of every step, every glance, every shift in atmosphere. The ground was uneven, the light inconsistent, the air thick with things he had never needed to understand before. Yet she walked like this was the only world she knew, and that realization settled heavily inside him. They exited the market, entering the narrower streets again. The noise faded behind them, replaced by a slower, heavier quiet. This time Abdul did not hesitate. He knew where they were going. The abandoned house stood ahead just as it had the night before, silent, worn, waiting. Zainab reached the door and paused. Her hand rested briefly against the wood as if steadying herself. Then she spoke. "Before you come inside, understand this." Abdul stopped a step behind her. "This is not your world." She continued, her voice calm but firm. "And whatever you think you're looking for, you may not be ready for it." Abdul met her words without flinching. "I've already heard enough to know I can't walk away." Zainab's eyes flickered. For a moment, something softer passed through them, but it vanished quickly. "You could have," she said quietly. "You just chose not to." Abdul didn't respond. Because she was right. He had chosen this, chosen to follow, chosen to stay, chosen to step into something that had already begun to unravel his sense of control. Zainab pushed the door open. This time, Abdul entered with her. Inside, the air was warmer. The oil lamp still burned, casting that same fragile glow across the room. The shadows danced against the cracked walls, shifting with every small movement. Mariam Sani lay in the same place. But she looked weaker. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with visible effort. The passage of just one day had changed something. Zainab moved quickly to her side. "Amma," she said softly, kneeling down. "I'm here." Mariam's eyes opened slowly. They found Zainab first. Then after a moment, they found Abdul. There was no surprise in them, only recognition. "You came back," she whispered. Abdul stepped closer. "Yes." Zainab adjusted the cloth beneath her mother's head, her hands careful practiced. "She shouldn't be speaking," she said without looking at Abdul. "She needs rest." Mariam let out a faint breath that almost resembled a laugh. "Rest," she murmured. "There is not much time left for that." Zainab's hand stilled. "Don't say that." Mariam's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter. "My child, some truths cannot wait for comfort." The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Abdul felt it again, that pull, that pressure building inside him. "Then tell me," he said. Zainab turned sharply. "No!" But this time her voice carried less force, more fear. Abdul looked at her. "I deserve to know." Zainab stood up slowly. "No," she said again, more firmly now. "You don't." Their eyes locked. The tension returned stronger than before. "You came into our lives without invitation," she continued. "You followed me. You brought your world into this place, and now you think you deserve answers." Abdul held her gaze. "I think I deserve the truth." Zainab's expression tightened. "The truth doesn't belong to you." Mariam's voice broke through again. "It does," she whispered. Both of them turned. Zainab's face changed instantly. "Amma, please." But Mariam shook her head weakly. No more silence. Her eyes moved to Abdul. "For years, I waited for this moment," she said. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth does not die, even when it is buried." Abdul felt something inside him shift again. "What truth?" he asked. Mariam studied his face carefully, as if searching for something beneath the man he had become. "You were young," she said slowly. "Too young to understand the weight of your choices." Abdul's brow furrowed. "I don't remember you." "I know," she replied. Zainab stepped closer to her mother, her voice urgent. "You don't have to do this now." Mariam reached for her hand. "My child, this is not just my story." Zainab's eyes filled with something deeper: pain, fear, and something else: protection. "You think this will help," she said quietly. "You think telling him changes anything?" Mariam didn't answer immediately. Because she knew the truth. It wouldn't change the past, but it might change what came after. Abdul took another step forward. "You said I was involved," he said, in what Mariam's breathing grew heavier. Each word now required effort. In a moment, when power was used to silence truth, Abdul's chest tightened. Fragments of memory flickered again. A house, voices raised, a woman pleading, his father's voice cold, decisive, and himself, standing there, watching, not understanding, not stopping it. "You were there," Mariam continued, not as the one who gave the order, but as the one who witnessed it. Abdul's hands clenched slightly. "What order?" Mariam closed her eyes briefly, as if reliving something she had tried to forget. "I was accused," she said softly, "of something I did not do." Zainab's grip on her hand tightened. "Amma, they said I had stolen." Mariam continued. "Money, jewelry, anything they could name." Abdul's voice was low. "And you didn't, you?" The answer came without hesitation, without doubt. "I had served your household for years," she said, "with loyalty, with dignity." Abdul felt something sharp cut through his thoughts. "Then why? Because I was easy to remove." The words landed hard. Silence followed. Abdul's mind raced, but accusations require proof, he said. Mariam opened her eyes again. "Not when the people in power decide the outcome first." That struck deeper than anything else. Because Abdul knew that world. He lived in it, even now. Zainab spoke quietly. "They didn't just fire her." Abdul turned to her. Her eyes were no longer defensive. They were steady. They humiliated her, she continued. In front of everyone, called her a thief, threw her out. Abdul's chest tightened further. "And you?" he asked. Zainab held his gaze. "I wasn't born yet." The words hung between them, heavy, meaningful, but not yet complete. Abdul felt it. The connection, close, too close. "What happened after that?" he asked. Mariam's voice dropped to a whisper. "I lost everything." A pause. "And then I discovered I was carrying something they could never take from me." Abdul's breath slowed. The room felt smaller, closer. What he asked. Mariam looked at him. Not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to face. Truth. And just as her lips parted to speak, her body faltered. Her breath caught. Zainab's eyes widened instantly. The moment, shattered. The truth once again. Just out of reach. Zainab's voice broke sharp and trembling as she caught her mother before she could slip further. Mariam's body had gone suddenly limp, her breath uneven, her chest rising too fast and too shallow at the same time. The fragile balance that had held her together just moments ago was collapsing. Abdul froze for half a second. Then instinct took over. "What does she need?" he asked, stepping forward. Zainab didn't look at him. "Water. No, wait." Her hands trembled as she tried to steady her mother's head. "Her medicine. Where is it?" "In the bag." "No, not that one, the small one." Abdul moved quickly, scanning the dim room. The oil lamp cast shifting shadows, making everything harder to see. A worn cloth bag lay near the wall, its contents barely organized. He dropped to one knee, opening it. Inside, small bottles, tablets, strips of medication, some half-used, some expired. His chest tightened. This wasn't treatment. This was survival. "Which one?" he asked. Zainab reached out her fingers, brushing against his as she grabbed a small brown bottle. "That one, just one tablet." Abdul handed it to her immediately. She lifted Mariam's head gently, her voice soft but urgent. Please, take this." Mariam's lips parted slightly, her breathing still unstable. Zainab placed the tablet carefully in her mouth and guided a small sip of water after it. For a moment, nothing changed. Then slowly, Mariam's chest began to rise more evenly. Not stable, but less chaotic. Zainab let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Abdul remained still, beside them, watching. Not as an outsider, but as someone now pulled into the moment completely. Minutes passed in silence, only the sound of breathing, the flicker of the lamp, and the weight of everything that had almost been said. Finally, Mariam's eyes opened again, weak but present. "Zainab," she whispered. "I'm here," Zainab replied immediately, her voice soft again, protective. Mariam's gaze shifted to Abdul, still there, still watching. "You see now," she murmured. Abdul frowned slightly. "See what that time," she said faintly. "Does not wait for us to be ready." Zainab tightened her grip on her mother's hand. "Don't talk," she said. "Please." But Mariam shook her head weakly. "If I don't, there may be no time left." The words cut through the room like a blade. Zainab closed her eyes for a moment. Pain, fear, helplessness, all at once. Abdul felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Responsibility. Not the kind tied to business. Not the kind that could be delegated. Something else. "I can take her to a hospital," he said suddenly. Zainab's eyes snapped open. No. The answer was immediate, firm. Abdul was taken aback. "She needs proper care," he insisted. This he gestured lightly to the room. "This isn't enough." Zainab stood slowly, positioning herself between him and her mother. "It's enough," she said. "It's not. It is for us." The tension rose again, but this time it was different. Less anger, more fear. "You're letting her suffer," Abdul said quietly. Zainab's expression hardened. "You think I don't know that?" Her voice cracked slightly at the edge. "You think I haven't tried everything I can?" Abdul held her gaze. "Then let me help." Zainab shook her head. "No. Why, because your help always comes with a cost." The words landed heavily. Abdul frowned. "That's not true." Zainab let out a quiet, bitter breath. "You don't even realize it." Mariam's voice rose again, fragile but present. "Zainab." Zainab turned back immediately. "Yes, Amma." Mariam reached for her hand again. "My child." "Listen." Zainab knelt beside her once more. Mariam's eyes moved between them. "You cannot carry everything alone," she said softly. Zainab's lips pressed together. "I'm not alone." Mariam's gaze softened. "But you are tired. That broke something. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough." Zainab lowered her head slightly. For the first time since Abdul had known her, she looked vulnerable. Abdul stepped closer, carefully. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "I'm here because something connects us, whether you accept that or not." Zainab didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. Mariam watched them both, and in that moment, she understood something they didn't yet fully see. "This was always going to happen," she whispered. Abdul looked at her. "What was this meeting?" Zainab shook her head. "No, it wasn't." Mariam smiled faintly. "You think life is made of accidents," she said, "but some paths, no matter how far they drift apart, find their way back." Abdul felt that again, that pull, that sense of something unfinished. "You said I was there," he said quietly, "that I saw what happened to you." Mariam nodded faintly. "Yes. Then why don't I remember?" Mariam's eyes darkened slightly. "Because remembering would have forced you to question everything you were taught." That hit deeper than expected. Abdul exhaled slowly. "And what was I taught?" "That power protects itself," she said, "even when it is wrong. Silence, heavy, unavoidable." Zainab looked between them. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "Whatever happened back then, it's done." Mariam turned to her. "No," she said softly. "It is not done." Zainab's voice rose slightly. "Amma, you deserve to know," Mariam said. Zainab froze. The words struck differently this time, not as a threat, but as something inevitable. Abdul watched her, carefully. "What is she talking about?" he asked. Zainab didn't answer. Her eyes moved away. For the first time, she didn't meet his gaze. Mariam reached out again, her hand trembling. She took Zainab's hand, and then slowly extended her other hand toward Abdul. A silent gesture. A bridge. Abdul hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward. He took her hand. It was light, fragile, but warm. Mariam looked at both of them, and for a moment, despite everything, there was peace in her expression. "Before I leave this world," she whispered, "there is something that must be said." The air in the room shifted again. Heavier, final. Zainab's grip tightened. "No," she said softly. "Not like this." Mariam's eyes remained steady. "There is no other way." Abdul felt his heart begin to pound again. The truth was close now, closer than ever. Whatever had been buried for years was about to surface. Mariam drew in a slow, difficult breath. Her lips parted, her eyes fixed on Abdul, and just before the words could fully form, a distant sound echoed outside. Footsteps, more than one. Zainab's head snapped up. Abdul turned sharply toward the door. The moment fractured, again. But this time, something else had arrived, and it was not part of the past. The sound outside was unmistakable. Footsteps, not hurried, but deliberate. More than one person. Gravel shifting under weight. A quiet murmur of voices, low-controlled, familiar, in a way that immediately set Abdul on edge. Zainab's body stiffened. Her hand tightened around her mother's. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Abdul had already turned toward the door. His instincts, sharpened by years of navigating danger in boardrooms and beyond, told him this was not coincidence, not timing, not chance. Someone had followed, or worse, someone had been watching long before he arrived. The door creaked slightly as a shadow moved past it. Then a knock, not loud, not aggressive, but confident. Zainab didn't move. Neither did Abdul. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a voice. "Open the door." Male, firm, used to being obeyed. Abdul's jaw tightened. He recognized that tone. Authority. Zainab shook her head slightly. "No," she whispered. Mariam's breathing grew uneven again. The tension in the room thickened. The voice outside came once more. "We know you're inside." Abdul stepped forward. "Wait!" Zainab hissed, grabbing his arm. "This isn't your problem." Abdul looked at her. "It is now." Before she could stop him again, he moved toward the door. Each step slow, measured, the weight of the moment pressing down with every inch. He reached the door, paused, then pulled it open. 3 men stood outside, dressed in plain clothes, but their posture gave them away immediately. Not civilians, not neighbors, officials. The one in front stepped forward slightly. His eyes scanned Abdul quickly, calculating, assessing, then narrowed. "Mr. Bello," he said. Not a question. Recognition. Abdul's expression didn't change. "And you are," he replied calmly. The man reached into his pocket, flashing an ID briefly. "Inspector Tunda Balogun," he said. "We've been looking for this place." Abdul's mind moved quickly. Police. But not random, not accidental. "What do you want?" Abdul asked. Balogun's gaze shifted past him into the dim interior of the house. "We're here for her." Zainab stepped forward immediately. "No!" Her voice was sharp, protective. Balogun's eyes moved to her. "You must be Zainab Musa." She didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. "We received information," Balogun continued, "about an individual connected to an unresolved case." Abdul felt something cold settle in his chest. "What case?" he asked. Balogun looked back at him. "A theft case," he said, "from over 20 years ago." The words hit like a distant echo. Mariam's voice. "I was accused." Abdul's eyes darkened. "That case was never proven," he said. Balogun raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," he replied. "Because according to our records, it was never closed either." Zainab stepped in front of the doorway now. "You're not taking her anywhere," she said. Balogun's expression remained neutral. "That's not your decision." "She's sick," Zainab insisted. "She can barely move." "That may be," Balogun said calmly. "But the law doesn't disappear because time has passed." Abdul stepped forward slightly. "The law also requires evidence," he said. Balogun looked at him again. "And we intend to review it." A pause. Then more quietly, "Which is why we need to speak with her." Abdul held his gaze. "There are other ways to do that." Balogun's lips curved slightly. "Of course," he said. "And if this were any other situation, perhaps we would." His eyes flicked briefly toward the interior again. "But this case has resurfaced under unusual circumstances." Zainab's voice cut in. "What circumstances?" Balogun didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket again. This time, pulling out a folded document. He handed it toward Abdul. "Perhaps you should see for yourself." Abdul took it, unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page quickly, then slowed. then stopped. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "What is it?" Zainab demanded. Abdul didn't answer right away, because what he was reading didn't just concern the past, it reached into the present. "This case," Abdul said slowly, "was reopened last week." Balogan nodded. "That's correct," by who Balogan met his gaze directly. "An anonymous submission." Zainab frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to," Balogan replied. "It only has to be credible enough to investigate." Abdul's mind raced. Anonymous, recent, targeted. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Whoever submitted this, Abdul said, knew exactly what they were doing. Balogan gave a small, unreadable smile. "That would appear to be the case." Zainab shook her head. "This is wrong," she said. "She didn't do anything." Balogan's expression didn't change. "That's not for us to decide here." He gestured slightly toward the interior. "We need to speak with her." Zainab stood firm. "No." The word came out stronger this time. More certain. Balogan's patience thinned slightly. "Miss Musa." He said, "You are obstructing an investigation. I'm protecting my mother, and we are doing our job." The tension rose, sharp, unforgiving. Abdul stepped between them. "Enough," he said quietly. Both of them turned to him. He looked at Balogan. "You're not taking her tonight." Balogan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And on what authority are you making that decision?" Abdul didn't hesitate. "Mine." A long pause followed. The other two officers shifted slightly behind Balogan, sensing the shift in power. Balogan studied Abdul carefully. "You're asking us to ignore procedure. I'm asking you to use judgment." Another pause. "Then you have 24 hours, Abdul continued. "After that, I will personally ensure she is brought in safely." Zainab turned sharply. "What are you doing?" Abdul didn't look at her. "Buying time." Balogan considered this carefully. Then finally, 24 hours, he repeated. Abdul nodded. "Yes." Balogan glanced once more toward the interior, then back at Abdul. "Very well," he said. "But understand this." His voice lowered slightly. "If she disappears, this becomes something else entirely." Abdul held his gaze. "She won't." Balogan nodded once, then stepped back. The other officers followed. Their footsteps faded into the night. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried weight, pressure, a ticking clock. Zainab turned to Abdul immediately. "Why did you say that?" she demanded. "You don't get to decide anything for us." Abdul finally looked at her. "I just stopped them from taking her tonight. That doesn't mean you get to control what happens next." "I'm not trying to control it," he said. "I'm trying to understand it." Zainab shook her head. "No," she said. "You're trying to fix something you don't even fully know." Abdul's voice dropped. "Then tell me." Zainab hesitated. For a moment, only a moment, then no. But this time, it wasn't as strong, because now time was no longer on their side. Abdul looked past her, to Mariam, still lying there, still holding the truth. And now, with only 24 hours left before everything changed, the past was no longer something buried. It was something coming back, and this time, it wasn't coming quietly. The silence after the officers left did not bring relief. It brought weight. Heavy, pressing, inescapable weight. Zainab stood near the doorway, her chest rising and falling faster than before, her mind racing through possibilities she could no longer control. The fragile boundary she had built between her world and Abdul's had been shattered completely. And now, there was no turning back. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally, her voice low but sharp. Abdul remained still for a moment, watching the darkness outside, before turning back to her. "They were going to take her," he replied calmly. Zainab shook her head. "You don't understand," she said. "If they take her, they won't just question her. They'll dig. They'll reopen everything." "That's already happening," Abdul said. Her eyes flashed. "And you think you can stop it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. Zainab froze slightly. Because she expected resistance, denial, control, but not honesty. "I don't think I can stop it," Abdul continued. "But I think I can make sure the truth comes out properly." Zainab let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "The truth," she repeated. "You think the truth matters?" Abdul met her gaze. "It should." Zainab stepped closer, her voice tightening. "It didn't matter 20 years ago." The words landed hard. Abdul didn't look away. "No," he said quietly. "It didn't." A pause. "Then but it does now." Zainab stared at him, searching, not for confidence, but for weakness. And for the first time, she didn't find it. Not the kind she expected. Instead, she saw something else. Guilt. Real. Unhidden. It unsettled her more than anything else he had said. Mariam shifted slightly on the mattress, drawing their attention back. Her breathing had steadied again, but only barely. Time was not on their side. Zainab moved back to her, immediately kneeling beside her, adjusting the thin cloth beneath her shoulders. "Amma," she whispered softly. "You need to rest." Mariam's eyes opened slowly. "They came," she murmured. Zainab nodded. "But they're gone. For now," Abdul added. Mariam looked at him. A long, quiet look. "You gave us time," she said. Abdul inclined his head slightly. "Yes." Mariam exhaled faintly. "Time is a strange thing," she whispered. "Sometimes it gives us a chance, and sometimes it only reminds us how little we have left." Zainab's hand tightened again. "Don't say that." Mariam turned her gaze back to her daughter. "My child, listen to me." Zainab hesitated, then nodded slowly. Mariam's voice was weaker now, each word measured, important. "You have carried this alone for too long." Zainab shook her head. "I'm not alone." Mariam's lips curved slightly. "You have been alone in your pain." Zainab looked away. Her silence was answer enough. Abdul watched quietly. Every word spoken in that room felt like a piece of something larger, something he was only beginning to understand. Mariam turned her attention back to him. "You asked for truth," she said. Abdul nodded. "Yes." Mariam closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering what little strength she had left. "Then listen carefully," she whispered. The air in the room shifted again. Zainab felt it. She looked up sharply. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." Mariam didn't open her eyes. "There is no more later," she replied. Zainab's voice trembled slightly. "You don't have to tell him everything." Mariam's eyes opened again. Not everything she said, only what cannot remain hidden. Abdul stepped closer, not rushing, not forcing, just present. "I'm listening," he said quietly. Mariam studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke. "When I was accused, I was not alone." Abdul frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Mariam's gaze shifted briefly to Zainab, then back to him. "There was a reason they needed me gone." The words landed slowly, carefully. Abdul felt something tighten in his chest. What reason? Mariam's breathing faltered slightly, but she continued. "Because I knew something I should not have known." Abdul's mind sharpened instantly, what Mariam hesitated. Not because she didn't want to say it, but because saying it would change everything. Zainab's voice broke in again. "Amma, please." Mariam squeezed her hand weakly. "My child, this truth is yours as well." Zainab's eyes filled with conflict, fear, anger, and something deeper, readiness she didn't want. Abdul watched her carefully, then looked back at Mariam. "What did you know?" he asked again. Mariam's voice dropped to a whisper. There was money missing. Abdul's brow furrowed. That's what you were accused of. Mariam shook her head faintly. No. A pause. That was the story they told. Abdul's expression hardened. Then what really happened? Mariam's eyes held his. Someone else took it. Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Abdul's thoughts moved quickly. Who? Mariam didn't answer right away. Instead she said, I saw it happen. Abdul's breath slowed. You witnessed it? Yes. Then why didn't you say anything? Mariam let out a faint, broken breath. I did. A long pause followed. Then they didn't believe me. Zainab's voice was quiet now. They didn't want to. Mariam nodded faintly. Because believing me would have meant accusing someone they could not afford to accuse. Abdul's chest tightened again, a cold realization creeping in. Who? He asked again, his voice lower now. Mariam's eyes flickered slightly. Not with fear, but with the weight of what she was about to say. Zainab shook her head again. No. But this time, it was too late. Mariam looked directly at Abdul, and for the first time, there was no distance left between past and present. It was someone from your family. The words hit harder than anything before. Abdul didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Zainab closed her eyes. Because this was the line she had been trying to protect. The truth she had held back, not just for her mother, but for herself. Abdul's voice came slowly, carefully. Who? In my family. Mariam's lips parted. Her breath faltered again, the effort of speaking now pushing her to her limits. But still, she held his gaze. Because this truth had waited too long. And now, it refused to stay buried. The room seemed to shrink around them. Abdul Rahman Bello stood completely still, as if any movement might shatter the fragile thread holding the moment together. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across the cracked walls, but none of it mattered now. Only one thing mattered, the name that had not yet been spoken. Mariam Sani struggled to breathe, her chest rising unevenly, her strength fading with each passing second. Yet her eyes remained locked on Abdul's as if she had been waiting for this exact moment for years. Zainab tightened her grip on her mother's hand. Amma, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't have to do this now. But Mariam shook her head barely. This is why I held on, she murmured. Abdul felt his throat dry. Who? He asked again, his voice quieter now but heavier. Who in my family? Mariam closed her eyes for a brief second, and then, your father. The words landed like a collapse, not loud, not explosive, but devastating in their quiet certainty. Abdul didn't react immediately, not outwardly. But inside, everything shifted. My father, he repeated slowly. Mariam nodded faintly. Yes. Zainab lowered her head, her eyes closing tightly as if she had already lived this moment too many times. Abdul's mind moved rapidly, searching, rejecting, resisting. No, he said. That doesn't make sense. Mariam's gaze didn't waver. He took it, she said. And when I saw, he made sure I would never be believed. Abdul took a step back. His chest tightened. That's not possible, he said again, though the certainty in his voice was gone. Because deep inside, something was stirring. Fragments, broken pieces of memory he had buried without even knowing it. His father's voice, sharp, controlled, a conversation behind closed doors, a woman crying, and himself standing in the hallway, listening, not understanding, not stepping in. Why would he do that? Abdul asked, his voice strained. Mariam's lips trembled slightly. Because the money was never meant to be found missing, she said. It was meant to disappear quietly, into something else. Abdul's mind caught on that. Something else. Mariam's breathing grew more labored. A deal, she whispered. One that could not be traced back to him. Abdul felt a cold wave move through him. His father had always been powerful. Respected, feared, but also careful, calculated. The kind of man who would eliminate risk without hesitation, even if that risk was a human life. "And you saw it," Abdul said slowly. Mariam nodded. "I saw enough. And when you told them, they silenced me." Zainab's voice came quietly. "They called her a thief," she said, "so no one would listen." Abdul's jaw tightened. "And I was there." Mariam looked at him. "Yes." A long silence followed. Abdul's eyes drifted slightly unfocused now as memories long ignored began to surface more clearly. A younger version of himself, standing at the top of a staircase, watching as his father spoke to staff below, hearing words like discipline, trust consequences, seeing a woman being escorted out, crying, pleading, and himself turning away, because it was easier not to question, easier to believe what he was told. "You didn't stop it," Mariam said gently, not accusing, just stating a truth. Abdul swallowed. "I didn't understand, I know." That made it worse, because she wasn't blaming him, she was acknowledging him, and that meant he had no shield to hide behind. Zainab stood slowly, her face pale. "You see now," she said quietly to Abdul. "This is why we didn't want you here." Abdul looked at her. "I needed to know. Did you?" she asked. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper. "Or did you just need to satisfy your curiosity?" Abdul flinched slightly at that. "Because part of it was true, but not all of it." "It's more than that now," he said. Zainab shook her head. "No," she replied. "For you it's still a choice." She stepped closer. "But for us, it was never a choice." Mariam's breathing hitched again. Zainab immediately turned back to her, kneeling once more. "Amma, please, don't talk anymore." But Mariam lifted her hand weakly. "There is one more thing," she whispered. Zainab froze. "No." Abdul felt it again. That pull, stronger than before. What he asked. Mariam's eyes moved between them, and for the first time, there was something like urgency in them. "After I was sent away," she said slowly, "I discovered I was not alone anymore." Abdul's chest tightened. He already knew what she meant, but hearing it was something else. Entirely. "You were pregnant," he said. Mariam nodded faintly. "Yes." Zainab closed her eyes, her breathing shallow now, as if she had been holding this moment back her entire life. Abdul's voice lowered. "And the child?" Mariam looked at him, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with something final, something undeniable. "Was yours." The words settled into the room, like a truth that could no longer be undone. Abdul didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because everything inside him had just been rewritten. Zainab's hand slipped from her mother's for a brief second, then tightened again. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You weren't supposed to know like this." Abdul turned to her slowly, his eyes searching her face now, really seeing her, not as a maid, not as a stranger, but as something else entirely, something that had been standing in front of him all along. "You're saying," he began, his voice unsteady for the first time. "You're my Zainab," didn't let him finish. "No," she said sharply. The word cut through the moment. Abdul stopped. Zainab stood up, her eyes now filled with something stronger than fear. Resistance. "You don't get to say it like that," she continued. "You don't get to suddenly claim something you walked away from before it even began." Abdul's chest tightened. I didn't know. And that makes it better, she asked. He hesitated, because he didn't have an answer. Mariam watched them both, her strength fading, but her purpose fulfilled. The truth, she whispered, does not come to make things easier. Zainab turned back to her, her expression breaking. Amma. Mariam reached for her one last time. My child, whatever happens next, you must decide for yourself. Zainab shook her head, tears finally slipping down her face. I don't want this, she said. Mariam's eyes softened. I know. Abdul stood there. Between them, between past and present, between who he had been and who he might have to become. The truth was no longer hidden. It was no longer waiting. It was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. No one spoke for a long time after the truth came out. The little room seemed to hold its breath. The oil lamp burned lower, its flame bending each time the night wind slipped through the cracks in the wall. Outside, somewhere far away, a dog barked and then went quiet again. Inside, there was only the sound of Mariam's breathing, thin, strained, frighteningly, fragile. Abdul Rahman Bello stood in the same place, but he no longer felt like the same man who had walked into that house. The words still echoed inside him. Yours. Not as a blessing, not as joy, not as some miraculous reunion, but as indictment, as consequence, as something life had kept hidden until there was no more room left to hide it. Zainab had moved away from him now. She was kneeling beside her mother again, one hand resting lightly on Mariam's chest, as if she could steady the pain there by sheer will. The other hand gripped the edge of the mattress so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. Abdul looked at her and saw 100 things at once. The shape of her jaw, the stillness she used like armor, the refusal to bend, and now, unbearable in its clarity, traces of himself. Not enough to soften the truth, only enough to make it hurt. I should have known, he said quietly, though the words sounded empty even to him. Zainab did not turn around. No, she said, you should have cared. The sentence landed with a force sharper than anger. Abdul fell silent again, because there was no defense against that, not one he could respect. Mariam shifted slightly and winced, a small broken sound escaping her lips. Zainab leaned in immediately. Amma, don't move. Her voice changed whenever she spoke to her mother. It lost its steel. It became warmer, softer, almost childlike in its tenderness. Mariam opened her eyes halfway. You are crying. I'm not. Zainab lied, but tears were already on her face. Mariam's fingers lifted weakly, brushing against her daughter's wrist. You have always lied badly. For the first time since Abdul entered that house, the faintest ghost of a smile touched Zainab's mouth. It vanished almost immediately. Abdul stepped closer, carefully, as if any sudden movement might make the room reject him. She needs a hospital, he said. Zainab stiffened at once. No. The answer came so quickly, it was almost instinct. She's getting worse. I know that. Then let me take her. Zainab stood up so fast that the lamp flame trembled with the movement. She turned to face him fully now, and the tears in her eyes did nothing to soften the fury there. I said no. Abdul held her gaze. This is not about pride. No, she said, her voice shaking. It's about dignity. He frowned. Dignity will not keep her alive. Her face changed at that. Something raw opened in it. You think I don't know that? She asked. You think I haven't counted every tablet, every borrowed naira, every night she couldn't breathe, and I thought she would die before morning? Abdul did not answer. Zainab took a step toward him. You think I haven't begged, she went on. You think I haven't walked to clinics that looked at her and then looked at my clothes and already decided what kind of answer to give me. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. I know exactly what she needs. I know the names of the tests, the treatment, the transport, the deposit they ask for before they even touch her. I know all of it." She pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "And I know I cannot afford it." The room fell silent again. Those words did not sound like surrender. They sounded like the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long without rest. Abdul lowered his voice. "Then let me pay for it." Zainab laughed once, a hollow, painful sound. "Of course," she said. "That is what men like you always think. That money can arrive late and still call itself mercy. This is not that." "Then what is it?" Abdul hesitated, because he did not know how to name what he felt. Guilt, yes. Shock, yes. But also something heavier than both. Something that came with no experience, no preparation, no language. A father's panic. He had not earned that word. He knew he had not. But the fear in him was real. "It's responsibility," he said at last. Zainab stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she despised. "Responsibility," she repeated. "You want to talk about responsibility now?" Mariam stirred again. "Zainab." But Zainab was no longer able to stop. Where was responsibility when she was thrown out? She demanded, pointing toward her mother without looking away from Abdul. Where was responsibility when she was sick and pregnant and alone? Where was it when I was a child? Asking why my mother coughed blood into cloth at night and still went to work in the morning. Abdul swallowed hard. "I did not know." "Yes," Zainab said. "That is the sentence rich people hide inside. I did not know. I did not see. I did not mean for it to happen." She shook her head slowly. "But people still suffer while you are not knowing." The words went through him like iron. He could not deny any part of them. Mariam drew a weak breath. "My daughter, enough." Zainab turned at once, dropping back to her knees. "Sorry, Amma. I'm sorry." Mariam looked at her for a long moment, then shifted her gaze to Abdul. "She is tired," Mariam whispered. "I can see that," Abdul replied. "No," Mariam said, faintly. "You are only beginning to." Zainab lowered her head. Abdul saw the tremor in her shoulders before he realized she was trying not to cry again. He looked around the room. The cracked walls, the rusted basin in one corner, the medicine bottles laid out with desperate precision, the patched cloth bags, the mattress that had long stopped being worthy of the word bed. Then he thought of his own house, of chandeliers, guest rooms, imported leather chairs no one used. Something inside him recoiled from the contrast, not because he was seeing poverty for the first time, but because now it had a face, a name, a voice. His voice lived somewhere inside that contrast. "I am taking her tonight," he said quietly. Zainab looked up sharply. "No! She may not survive another episode like that. No. I have a car outside the main road. I can call a doctor ahead. She will be admitted." Before no, the force of her voice filled the room. Even Mariam closed her eyes. Zainab rose to her feet again, breathing hard now her grief and rage no longer separate things. "You keep speaking as if this is your decision," she said, "as if truth has suddenly given you rights." Abdul's own voice hardened slightly. "And you keep rejecting help that could save her, because it comes from you." He stared at her. "You would risk her life for that." Her eyes flooded again, but she did not look away. "You still don't understand? Then make me understand." Zainab pressed her lips together, fighting for control. When she spoke again, her voice was lower but far more devastating. "If I take your help," she said, "then everything becomes yours. The hospital bed, the medicine, the air she breathes, the story people will tell afterward. It will become Abdul Rahman Bello, saved the woman his family destroyed. Abdul Rahman Bello rescued the maid he never knew was his daughter. Abdul Rahman Bello made things right." She took another step toward him. "But some things do not become right because money arrives in a white envelope." Abdul had no answer ready, because what she was naming was bigger than one hospital bill. It was the terror of being swallowed by his version of the story. "I am not asking for gratitude," he said. "Good," Zainab replied, "because you will never have it." Mariam's breathing caught again, and both of them turned instantly. This time the episode was worse. Her chest struggled, her fingers curled. A dry, painful cough shook through her frail body, and when Zainab helped her turn slightly, a dark stain touched the cloth near her mouth. Zainab's voice broke completely. Abdul moved forward without thinking. "That's enough! We're leaving!" Zainab threw out an arm, blocking him. "No!" "She is bleeding." I said no, she will die here. The words burst out of him before he could soften them. And that was the moment everything stopped. Zainab went still, not calm, not accepting, still in the way a wound goes still when it has been touched exactly where it cannot bear to be touched. Then, with tears running freely now, she looked him straight in the eyes and said the thing that even Mariam seemed to fear hearing aloud. "I would rather lose everything," she whispered, "than let the man who ruined us become the man who saves us." Abdul's breath left him. Mariam closed her eyes, and in the silence that followed, the truth stood between them more mercilessly than before, not as revelation, but as judgment. The words did not fade after Zainab said them. They stayed in the room, like smoke after fire. Abdul Rahman Bello stood motionless, his eyes fixed on her face, but for the first time since he had entered that broken house, he no longer looked like a man searching for answers. He looked like a man being forced to stand inside them. "I would rather lose everything than let the man who ruined us become the man who saves us." There was no rage left in the sentence now, only truth, only pain, stripped of performance, and somehow that made it far worse. Abdul lowered his eyes briefly, not in surrender but because he no longer knew where to place the weight rising inside his chest. All his life, money had moved like an answer ahead of him. A problem appeared and resources followed. A threat emerged and influence contained it. But here in that dim room with a flickering lamp and a woman coughing blood into cloth, wealth had become something else. Not power, not rescue, an accusation. Mariam's breathing was uneven again, her body weaker after the coughing fit. Zainab was already kneeling beside her, one hand behind her shoulders, the other holding the cloth gently against her mouth. "Amma, slowly. Breathe slowly." Her voice trembled, but her hands did not. They had done this before, too many times. Abdul saw it in the speed of her movements, in the way her fear bent itself into skill. Mariam swallowed with effort and opened her eyes halfway. Her gaze moved first to her daughter, then slowly to Abdul. "Do not punish him with my breath," she whispered. Zainab's face tightened. "Amma, please don't." Mariam coughed once, weaker now. "Listen." Zainab shook her head. "No, not now." But Mariam, with what little strength remained in her, touched her daughter's wrist. "You have protected me long enough," she said softly. "Now let me protect you." Something in Zainab's expression shifted. Not agreement, not peace, just the exhaustion of someone who had been strong too long. Abdul stepped back half a pace, giving them space, though space did not free him from what he was hearing. Mariam waited until her breath settled enough to continue. "There are things she said that you know only in pieces." Zainab lowered her eyes. "Amma, you know my suffering," Mariam said. "You know the hunger, the sickness, the years. But there are parts I kept from you because I wanted you to grow without that poison inside your heart." Abdul looked up sharply. Zainab did too. A silence followed deeper than the ones before. Then Zainab asked quietly, "What did you keep from me?" Mariam's hand trembled in hers. The day I was sent away, she whispered, I was already carrying you. Zainab's lips parted slightly. That much she knew, but Mariam was not finished. I was not only accused, I was threatened. Abdul's jaw tightened. By my father, Mariam looked at him. By men who spoke for him, men who said they were cleaning up trouble, before it touched the family name. Zainab's eyes hardened instantly. What trouble? Mariam closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, there was no softness left in them, only old memory. I told the truth, she said. I said I saw who took the money. I said I would not confess to a lie. I said I would speak if they tried to force me. Her breathing shuddered, and then they asked me whose child I was carrying. The room went still. Abdul felt his entire body tighten. Zainab stared at her mother without blinking. Mariam continued, her voice weak but unflinching. I had not told anyone yet, not even myself in full. But they already knew enough to guess. Your father had seen the way you... She stopped and looked at Abdul, correcting herself with effort the way he had looked at me before. Not often, not openly, but enough for danger to exist. Abdul's brow pulled together. I looked at you. Mariam held his gaze. You were young, she said. Too young to understand the damage a powerful man's affection could cause when others were watching. Fragments moved through Abdul's mind again. Not complete scenes, not clear memories, just feelings, restlessness, a hidden tenderness, the recklessness of youth inside a house ruled by pride. He swallowed hard. We were involved. Mariam nodded once, for a short time. Zainab's face lost color. The world she had built around silence had always had shadows, but now the shadows were taking shape. I never told you, Mariam said to her daughter, because I wanted you to believe. Your life began with me choosing you, not with men deciding what to do with us. A tear slid down Zainab's cheek, but she did not wipe it away. What did they do? She asked. Mariam's fingers curled against the cloth. They told me to disappear, she said, to leave the city before morning. They said if I spoke, I would be arrested properly, not only accused. They said I would lose the baby before it ever learned my voice. Abdul felt sick. No boardroom crisis, no funeral, no scandal in the papers had ever struck him this way. Because none of those things had crawled backward through time and placed his name beside a frightened pregnant woman standing alone against a family empire. I didn't know, he said again, though. Now the words sounded smaller than ever. Mariam nodded faintly. You did not know everything. That was not mercy. Abdul understood that immediately. It was distinction, not innocence, just distinction. I came to you, Mariam said, and Abdul's head lifted sharply. What, after they threw me out? Before I left, I came to find you. His breath caught. Mariam's eyes did not move from his. You were in the courtyard near the back gate. You remember that place. And suddenly, like a door forced open, something cracked inside him. The courtyard, a neem tree, a woman in tears. His own voice saying, what happened? A servant dragging luggage. His father's driver watching from a distance. Abdul's hand went to the back of a chair that was not there, as if the room itself had shifted under him. I remember, he whispered, then stopped. Not all of it, but enough. Mariam saw it in his face. I told you I was innocent, she said. I told you they had lied. I told you I was carrying your child. Zainab turned slowly toward Abdul. The pain in her face now sharpened by something new. Memory, or rather, the fact that he had one. Abdul's lips parted, but no words came at first. He swallowed. I remember you crying. Mariam gave a weak, sad nod. Yes. Abdul's voice lowered into something raw. I told you I would speak to him. You did. Zainab stared at him. And, did you? She asked. The question was quiet, but it cut deeper than shouting. Abdul closed his eyes for one brief second. I tried. Zainab laughed once, but it was broken. Tried? Abdul looked at her again. I went to my father, he said. I remember that now. He slapped me before I finished. He told me I was too foolish to know what I was repeating. He said the woman was a thief and a liar. He told me if I spoke her name again, I would disgrace my mother. Mariam watched him carefully. I was sent away that same night, she whispered. Before dawn, Zainab's breathing grew shallow. So you knew, she said. Abdul shook his head immediately. Not like this. Not fully. But you knew enough, she said. He had no answer, because she was right. He had known enough to remember pain, enough to remember resistance, enough to have chosen at some point after that night to bury the whole thing instead of fighting harder. And now, a life had grown in the grave of that silence. Zainab stood up slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. All these years, she said, I thought you were just another rich man who never saw us. Her eyes held his, unshaking. But you did see us. Abdul opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. You saw the beginning, she continued, and then you let the rest happen. Those words landed harder than any accusation yet, because this time even Mariam did not interrupt. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere far away a motorcycle passed, then faded. Inside the ruined house, time felt as thin as Mariam's breathing. Abdul looked at both of them, the woman he had once failed in youth and the daughter he had unknowingly brought into the world, and then left to grow up inside the consequences of his silence. The truth was no longer simply that he was Zainab's father. The truth was worse. He had been given a chance long ago to change the direction of their lives, and he had lost it. Abdul Rahman Bello did not speak for several seconds after Zainab's words fell into the room. You saw the beginning, and then you let the rest happen. There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. No raised voice, no trembling accusation sharpened for effect. That was what made it so devastating. It sounded like a fact she had finally stopped protecting him from. And facts Abdul was beginning to understand were far more merciless than anger. The oil lamp had burned lower, and the room now seemed caught between shadow and faint gold light. Mariam lay weak and still, her eyes half open, listening even when she no longer had the strength to speak. Zainab remained standing near her mother, one hand resting on the wall beside the mattress, as if she needed something solid to hold herself upright. Abdul looked at both of them and felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, stripped of every title that had ever protected him. Not chairman, not billionaire, not Chief Bello's son, just a man standing in front of the ruins of other people's lives, realizing he had once had the chance to stop their collapse, and failed. I did let it happen, he said at last. The admission changed the room, not because it repaired anything. It did not. But truth recognized itself when it was spoken plainly. Zainab's face did not soften. Mariam closed her eyes briefly as though the words themselves had cost her something to hear. Abdul took a slow breath. I was young, he said, then immediately shook his head. No, that is not enough. I was young, yes, but I was also afraid, and I let fear become obedience. Zainab's voice came low and cold. Obedience to who he met her eyes, to the man who taught me that family reputation mattered more than any outsider's pain. The sentence stayed between them. Zainab looked away first, but not because she accepted it, only because she was tired. Mariam stirred faintly. He is remembering now. Abdul turned to her. Not enough, he said. Mariam's expression, fragile as it was, held a deep sadness. Memory never comes all at once. It comes like light through broken walls, in pieces. Abdul nodded slowly. That was exactly how it felt. Not a single revelation, but fragments, forcing themselves through the cracks. The courtyard, his father's slap, Mariam's face wet with tears, his own helpless anger, then emptiness. Years of emptiness, or not emptiness, suppression, a deliberate burying of anything that threatened the polished version of his life. "I need proof," he said suddenly. Zainab's head turned sharply. "Proof?" "Yes." Her eyes narrowed. "After everything you've heard tonight, you still need proof." Abdul shook his head. "Not for me. Not anymore." His voice dropped. "For what comes next?" That silenced her for a moment. He continued more steadily now. "The police have reopened the case. If someone sent that file anonymously, then someone wants the old lie to come back alive. And if the old lie returns before the full truth is documented, then your mother could still be dragged into this as the guilty one." He paused, then added, "And once powerful people move first, truth has to fight much harder to be heard." Zainab stared at him. It was the first time that night he had spoken not as a guilty man or a shaken father, but as someone who understood how systems protected themselves. Because he had lived inside those systems. Because in some ways he still did. Mariam opened her eyes again. "There are papers." Both Abdul and Zainab turned to her at once. Zainab leaned closer. "What papers?" Mariam's breathing was shallow, but her voice came more clearly than before, as though the need to say this had found one last pocket of strength inside her. "I kept what I could." Abdul stepped forward instinctively, where Mariam lifted one trembling hand slightly and pointed toward the far corner of the room, where an old metal trunk sat beneath a torn cloth and a stack of folded wrappers. It looked too worn to hold anything important. That was probably why it had survived untouched for so long. Zainab frowned. "Amma, what is in there?" Mariam looked at her daughter with apology in her eyes. "Things I hoped you would never need." Zainab swallowed hard. Abdul crossed the room slowly and knelt beside the trunk. The metal was old and rusted around the edges, but the lock had long since broken. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside were bundles of cloth, a small Quran wrapped in faded green fabric, several old photographs, and beneath them, a thick envelope tied with thread. He looked back at Mariam. This she nodded, faintly. Abdul untied the thread and opened the envelope. The first thing he saw was a photograph. He froze. It was old edges curled with time. A younger Mariam stood in the staff courtyard of the Bello estate. Beside her himself, perhaps 21, maybe 22, dressed casually, laughing at something outside the frame. Not intimate enough to prove romance to a stranger's eye, but close enough, easy enough to understand for anyone who knew how dangerous proximity became inside a household, ruled by suspicion and pride. Under the photograph lay folded letters. Abdul unfolded the first one, his fingers suddenly less steady. The handwriting was his. He knew it instantly, even before he read the words. "Mariam, I know my father is watching everyone now. I cannot come to the staff wing again tonight. Please wait for me tomorrow near the back courtyard. I will speak to you properly then." The rest blurred for a moment as shame rose like heat through his chest. He read another and another. Small letters, careful, naive in places, tender in a way he barely recognized in himself. He had written to her. He had cared. And then, when it mattered most, he had failed to stand against the machine that crushed her. Zainab was watching his face now. "What is it?" she asked. Abdul looked up slowly. "Letters. From who?" He swallowed. "From me." The room went silent. Even the night outside seemed to recede. Zainab took one hesitant step forward. Abdul handed her the top letter. She read only the first lines before her hand tightened around the paper. Her eyes lifted to him, not with softened understanding, but with something more complicated. Something harder. So it was true. Not only the paternity, not only the accusations, but the part that made all of it feel more brutal. There had once been care here. Promise. A human bond, which meant abandonment was not an accident of ignorance alone. It was also a collapse of courage. "There's more," Abdul said quietly. Beneath the letters was another folded document, thicker, official. A staff incident report, partly torn unsigned in one section, stamped in another. Abdul read quickly, his heart pounding. It was an internal memo from the Bello estate. Mariam Sani, accused of theft. Immediate dismissal recommended. No police referral pending private resolution. One line had been manually added in blue ink. Subject has become a destabilizing influence and must be removed before further damage is done. Abdul stared at that sentence. Destabilizing influence. Not thief, not criminal. A problem, a risk. A woman carrying a secret the family needed silenced. His jaw tightened. "This is enough to show intent," he said, more to himself than to either of them. Not everything, but enough to challenge the official narrative. Zainab's voice was quiet. "Challenge is not the same as win." Abdul looked at her. "No, but it's a beginning." Mariam drew a difficult breath. "There is one more thing." Abdul searched the trunk again. At the bottom, beneath the documents and cloth, his fingers touched a small sealed packet. He lifted it out. It contained a hospital card and a birth note, both damaged by time but still partly legible. Mother Mariam Sani, infant female. Father's name left blank, but attached to it, folded separately, was a note in Mariam's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, and if he ever comes looking, not because he is curious, but because he is finally ready to carry truth, tell him Zainab was never hidden from him by fate alone. She was hidden by fear, power, and the silence of men." Abdul closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not the guilt. That remained. Not the grief. That too remained. But underneath, both something else had arrived. Resolve. He turned back to Zainab. "The case can't be left in the hands of whoever reopened it," he said. "These documents need to be copied, secured, and submitted properly. Tonight." Zainab hesitated. And then, what Abdul looked at Mariam, then at the letters still in her hand, then back at the woman who had spent her life cleaning floors in his house, without knowing he was the man her mother once begged for help. Then he said quietly, "I stopped being the man who saw the beginning and did nothing." For the first time since he had entered that ruined house, Zainab did not immediately reject his words. She did not accept them either. But silence in that moment was no longer refusal. It was the space before decision. And outside, somewhere beyond the cracked walls and the darkness of the street, the morning that would test all of them was drawing closer. The night did not feel like night anymore. It felt like the edge of something irreversible. Abdul Rahman Bello stood beside the old metal trunk with Mariam's letters and documents in his hands, and for the first time in years he understood that truth was not only painful because of what it revealed. It was painful because once it stood fully in the room, everyone had to decide what kind of person they would be in its presence. Zainab remained near the mattress, one hand resting on the edge of it, the other still holding one of Abdul's old letters. She had not read beyond the first few lines yet. Even that small glimpse had unsettled something inside her. It was easier for most of her life to imagine Abdul as a distant man who knew nothing. That version of him was cruel in its negligence, but simple. This version was worse. This version had once cared. This version had once promised. And then this version had disappeared into comfort, wealth, obedience, and silence. Mariam's breathing had grown thinner. There was a hollowness to it now, a frailty that made every rise of her chest feel borrowed. Abdul knelt beside her. "We need to move quickly," he said softly. "I'll call my lawyer. Not from the house, from outside. We scanned these documents tonight. Make certified copies at first light and submit them before anyone else touches the case. Zainab looked at him sharply. And then, what the police will suddenly become, just because a rich man says so. Abdul met her gaze. No, but rich men created this lie. A rich man will have to stand in public when it breaks. The room fell silent after that, because for all her anger, Zainab knew what he was saying was true. Men like Abdul's father had built a world where some voices disappeared easily and others did not. And now one of those louder voices would have to be used, not to erase, but to expose. Mariam stirred slightly. "Come closer," she whispered. Both of them did. Her eyes moved first to Zainab. "My child. There is one last part." Zainab's face tightened immediately. "Amma, you need to save your strength." Mariam gave the smallest shake of her head. "There is no strength to save now." The sentence broke something quiet and terrible in the room. Zainab sat down fully on the floor beside her mother and took her hand in both of hers. Abdul remained close silent. Mariam looked at him next. "When I came to you in the courtyard that night," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "you were not the only one who heard me." Abdul frowned slightly. My father, Mariam, nodded faintly. He was standing at the upper balcony, watching. A cold stillness moved through Abdul's body. He could see it now, not clearly, not every detail, but enough. That feeling he had carried for years, the sense of being watched even in his private shame, had not been imagination. He heard everything Abdul asked. "Yes." Zainab's hand tightened around her mother's. Mariam continued. "He knew the child was yours before I left that house." The words landed harder than any before them. Abdul's face lost what little color remained in it. "No." Mariam's gaze did not waver. "Yes." A terrible quiet followed, because this changed even the shape of guilt. It was one thing for a powerful family to destroy a servant to protect its name. It was another thing entirely for that family to know an unborn child carried its blood, and still cast both mother and child into ruin. Zainab's breathing became shallow again. "He knew about me." Mariam turned her eyes to her daughter. "Yes." A tear slipped from Zainab's face and fell onto the back of her mother's hand. "And he said a child born from scandal would not enter that house," Mariam whispered. "He said if I stayed I would poison your future, and if I spoke I would lose you before I ever held you." Abdul closed his eyes briefly, pain passing across his face like something physical. "My father," he said, but the sentence did not finish, because there were no words large enough for what his father had done. Mariam's breathing caught again. Abdul instinctively reached toward her, but stopped when Zainab looked up. Not because she rejected the movement, but because both of them understood that nothing could stop what was coming now. Mariam kept speaking. "I left before dawn. I traveled north first, then back again. I took work where I could, cooking, washing, cleaning, anything." Her lips trembled with effort. By the time Zainab was old enough to ask about her father, I had already learned how this world answers women like me. Zainab lowered her head. Mariam's voice softened, so I gave her something better than a lie. I gave her dignity. I told her she came from hardship, yes, but not from shame. Zainab bent forward, then pressing her forehead gently against her mother's arm. "You gave me everything," she whispered. Mariam's fingers moved weakly in her daughter's hair. "No, I gave you survival. You made yourself into the rest." Abdul looked away for a moment, his throat tightening painfully. All the wealth he had built, all the power he carried, and still the strongest person in that room was the woman who had raised a daughter in abandonment and hunger without teaching her to bow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "My lawyer," he said quietly. "I need to call him now." Zainab looked up. "Here." No outside. But before I go, he paused, then looked at Mariam. Is there anything you want on record? Anything exact, I will have it written exactly as you say it. Mariam turned her face toward him again. For a long moment she said nothing. Then yes. Abdul opened the voice recorder on his phone and placed it near her carefully. Mariam gathered what remained of her breath. My name is Mariam Sani, she said, each word slow and deliberate. I was falsely accused of theft in the Bello family household. I did not steal. Chief Rahman Bello knew I did not steal. He removed me because I witnessed what I should not have seen, and because I was carrying the child of his son, Abdul Rahman Bello. I was threatened into silence. My daughter Zainab is innocent of every burden that followed. Let no one call our suffering a mystery. It had a cause. It had names. By the time she finished, the room had gone still, in a way that felt sacred. Abdul stopped the recording with shaking hands. Zainab was crying openly now, though quietly, as if even grief had to move carefully around her mother. Mariam looked at Abdul one final time with full awareness. I did not wait for you because I trusted money, she whispered. I waited because I wanted my daughter to be seen before I died. Abdul's eyes filled, though the tears did not fall. She is seen, he said, his voice unsteady. I swear to you, she is seen. Mariam gave the faintest nod. Then her gaze moved back to Zainab, and everything in her expression changed. It softened into motherhood alone. No history, no accusation, no fear, only love. My child, she said. Zainab moved even closer, clutching her mother's hand desperately now. I'm here, Amma. I'm here. You must live beyond this night. Please don't talk like that. You must. Zainab shook her head, sobbing now despite herself. Mariam drew in one more difficult breath. Do not let pain be the only thing you inherit. The words barely left her lips. Then her chest rose once, twice, and stopped. For a second. No one moved. Not Abdul, not Zainab. Not even the flame of the lamp seemed to flicker. Then Zainab's voice broke the silence. Not loudly, not with a scream, but with a small shattered sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the body could survive. Amma. She touched her mother's face, then her shoulder, then held both hands around her as if warmth could call life back. Amma, please. Abdul stared, unable to breathe properly, unable to step away, unable to undo a single thing that had led to this floor, this room, this final breath. Zainab turned to him then. Her face was wet with grief, but there was no confusion left in it now, no uncertainty, only devastation and truth. This, she whispered, is what your family did. Abdul did not defend himself. He did not speak. He simply stood there as Mariam lay still between them, carrying in death what she had carried in life, the full weight of a truth delayed too long. And in that broken house before dawn had even arrived, Abdul Rahman Bello understood that no public confession, no legal correction, no money, no influence, and no grief of his own would ever be enough to pay the debt that had just become final. Dawn did not arrive gently. It came pale and unforgiving through the cracks in the broken walls, laying weak strips of light across the floor. Where Mariam Sani's body still rested beneath the cloth Zainab had drawn over her. The lamp had burned out hours ago. The room no longer flickered with uncertainty. Now everything could be seen clearly. And clarity, Abdul Rahman Bello was learning, could be more brutal than darkness. Zainab had not moved far from her mother's side. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, knees drawn up slightly, one hand resting on the edge of the covered mattress, as though even now she needed some physical proof that Mariam had been real. Her eyes were swollen, emptied by too many tears, yet strangely dry now. Grief had passed through crying and become something quieter, something heavier. Abdul remained near the doorway, phone in hand. Coat forgotten beside him, documents and letters, stacked carefully in a cloth bag he had found in the trunk. He had made the calls before sunrise. To his lawyer, to a private doctor, though too late for the life that had already gone, to a senior journalist he trusted, and finally to Inspector Tunda Balogun. Not to negotiate, not to delay, but to say there would be a full statement supporting documents and a public correction before noon. He had not used the tone of a man protecting himself. He had used the tone of a man stepping forward to be struck first. Still, none of that seemed to matter in the face of the quiet inside the room. After a long silence, Zainab spoke without looking at him. "You move fast." Abdul did not mistake the sentence for praise. "I should have moved sooner," he replied. That made her look up, only briefly. But in that brief glance he saw what remained between them. Anger, exhaustion, disbelief, and something even harder than hatred. Judgment, not theatrical, not loud, just there, as permanent as scar tissue. "The police are coming back?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded once. "And the lawyer?" "He's waiting at the main road with 2 women from a legal aid group and a doctor. I asked for women first." He paused. "Not because that fixes anything. Because I thought it might make this easier." Zainab gave the smallest, bitterest, almost smile. "You are learning how late care sounds." Abdul accepted that without defense. "I am." A pause stretched between them. Then he said quietly, "I also called the burial committee from the mosque nearby. They will come respectfully, only when you're ready." That time, Zainab did not answer for several seconds. When she finally did, her voice had softened, not with forgiveness but with fatigue. She wanted a simple burial. "I know." Her head lifted. "You know." Abdul glanced toward Mariam's covered body. She wrote about it in one of the papers. Not directly. But there was a note folded with the hospital card. His voice lowered. "She planned even for death with more dignity than my family gave her in life." Zainab looked away again, and for a moment that sentence seemed to wound them both equally. Outside voices rose faintly in the distance. Morning was fully waking. The city would soon continue as though nothing had happened. Markets would open, office towers would light up, drivers would honk, staff in Abdul's house would prepare breakfast trays and lay polished cutlery on tables. And yet everything had changed. Not for Lagos, not for the world, for 3 people only. One already gone, one shattered, one standing in the ruins of what he should have been. Abdul crossed the room slowly and set the cloth bag containing the letters and documents on the floor a few steps from Zainab, rather than directly beside her. "I made copies before dawn," he said. "Digital and physical. Your mother's recorded statement is stored in 3 places. One with my lawyer, one with the journalist, and one with a legal aid office. No one can make it disappear now." Zainab looked at the bag, then at him. "You really think papers can carry what she lived?" "No," Abdul said, "but they can stop them from calling her a liar after she's gone." That landed. She said nothing, but her silence no longer pushed him away with the same force. After another stretch of stillness, Abdul spoke again. "I have also prepared a statement." Zainab's eyes narrowed slightly. "For who?" "For everyone." She stared at him now fully. "What kind of statement?" Abdul inhaled slowly. "The kind that ruins the right man at last." Something changed in her face. Not trust, not relief, but attention. He continued, "I will name my father. I will state that the accusation against your mother was false. I will state that she was removed from the Bello household under coercion and intimidation. I will state that I failed her then and that my silence allowed the harm that followed." Zainab held his gaze. "And me." The word came quietly, so quietly that it struck him harder than if she had shouted it. Abdul answered, just as quietly, "I will not name you publicly as my daughter, unless you choose it." A long pause. Then Zainab asked, Why? Because for the first time in your life, he said that decision should belong to you. That seemed to reach her in a place anger had not closed entirely. She looked down at her hands, at the fingernails worn by work, at the skin cracked by detergent water and years of labor inside houses that were never hers. When she finally spoke again, her voice was lower. She used to say blood is not always where love lives. Abdul nodded slowly. She was right. Another pause. Then Zainab said the one thing he had not prepared himself to hear. I don't know what to call you. He looked at her. He could have said father, could have said Abdul, could have said she didn't need to call him anything at all. Instead, he told the truth. You don't have to call me anything today. Her throat moved as she swallowed, because that perhaps was the first answer from him that did not ask something back. Footsteps approached outside. Not secretive this time. Open, measured, a respectful knock followed. Abdul stepped back immediately, letting Zainab decide. She rose slowly, every movement weighted by the sleepless night, and went to the door. When she opened it, Inspector Balogan stood there with a woman, Dr. Abdul's lawyer, Barrister Afeoma Nwosu, and two women from a community legal aid group. Behind them at a distance waited two elderly men from the mosque's burial committee. Balogan removed his cap. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of last night's official edge. We heard, he said quietly. Zainab nodded once. No more. Barrister Afeoma stepped forward gently. I'm sorry for your loss. Zainab moved aside and let them enter. What followed happened with the strange aching order that grief often imposes on chaos. The doctor confirmed what everyone already knew. The legal aid women sat with Zainab, first not touching her, until she nodded permission. Balogan reviewed the documents at a respectful distance, while Afeoma organized the copies, the recording, and a formal affidavit based on Mariam's statement. When Abdul handed over the old incident report and his letters, no one in the room pretended they were small things. Those papers were not merely evidence. They were the remains of a truth that had refused to die. Balogan finished reading and looked up at Abdul. You understand what happens once this goes forward? Yes, Abdul said. It will not stop at your father's name, the inspector said. It may reach the estate managers who helped, the old accountants, anyone tied to the cover-up. It may touch current holdings too. Abdul met his gaze. Then let it. Balogan studied him for one more second, then nodded. No admiration, just acknowledgement. That was enough. Later, after the formalities had begun and the burial arrangements were being prepared, Abdul stepped outside for the first time since dawn. The abandoned house looked even smaller in daylight, less mysterious, less haunted, just poor, just neglected, just one more place a city had trained itself not to see. He stood there until Zainab came out. She had covered her hair and face more carefully now, not to hide, but to steady herself for what came next. The committee is ready, she said. Abdul nodded. Then after a moment he asked, may I help carry her? Zainab looked at him for a long time, long enough that he forced himself not to say anything more, because this moment was not his to shape. Finally she answered, yes, just one word. But it was not forgiveness. It was something harder, more human, more honest. Permission, limited, painful, real. Together with the elderly men from the mosque, Abdul helped lift Mariam's body. The cloth was light, too light. It struck him then with unbearable force that the woman his family had feared enough to destroy had lived her final years with almost nothing. Yet she had remained heavier in truth than all the wealth he had inherited. As they carried her into the morning, neighbors watched quietly from a distance. No one knew the full story yet. but they saw enough to understand that something unusual was happening. A wealthy man with grief on his face, walking beside a maid who did not look at him, both of them bound by a loss no one outside could name. At the gate, before the path widened toward the road, Zainab stopped. So did Abdul. She turned to him at last. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, and utterly clear. "You said you would stop being the man who saw the beginning and did nothing." "Yes," Abdul said. She held his gaze. "Then don't do this halfway." He felt that like an oath being placed into his hands. "I won't." She nodded once, then added with quiet, devastating steadiness, "My mother does not need your sorrow now. She needs your truth." Abdul bowed his head slightly. "She will have it." And as they continued walking into the full light of morning, Abdul Rahman Bello understood that redemption, if it existed at all, would not begin with being accepted. It would begin with being exposed, with naming what had been hidden, with surrendering power where power had once done harm. Whether Zainab ever forgave him or not, whether she ever allowed him closer than this or not, the rest of his life had already been decided. He would spend it telling the truth his family had buried. And for the first time, that felt less like punishment and more like the bare minimum of justice. Some wounds do not begin with cruelty alone. They begin with silence, with the moment someone powerful chooses comfort over courage, reputation over truth, and distance over responsibility. That is what makes this story so painful and so real. Mariam did not lose her life because she lacked strength. Zainab did not grow up in hardship because they lacked dignity. They suffered because truth was buried by people who had the power to protect it and chose not to, and yet even in that pain, something extraordinary remained a live character. Mariam kept her dignity when the world stripped everything else away. Zainab kept her compassion, her discipline, and her strength, even while living in injustice. Their story reminds us that poverty does not erase worth, and suffering does not erase identity. But this story also teaches something harder. Regret is not redemption. Feeling guilty is not the same as making things right. Real accountability begins when a person stops protecting their image and starts telling the truth, even when that truth exposes their own failure. Abdul could not undo the years that were stolen. He could not give Mariam back the life she deserved. He could not erase the loneliness Zainab carried for so long. But he could do one necessary thing: stop the lie from living any longer. Sometimes justice does not come as a miracle. Sometimes it begins when one person finally admits, "I saw what was wrong, and I did not act." That kind of honesty is painful, but it is also the first step toward healing. If there is one lesson to carry from this story, it is this: never underestimate the damage of silence, and never underestimate the power of truth told at last. Be careful how you treat the vulnerable, because today's invisible person may be carrying a pain you helped create, or a truth that will one day rise. And if life ever gives you a chance to stand for what is right, do not wait until it is too late. Courage delayed can become sorrow that lasts for years. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you the most? And do you think Zainab should ever fully forgive Abdul? Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about justice, healing, family, and hope.